And welcome back to Sociology 305. And welcome to some of our guests who are here for the first time. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Myrna Goodman, who's going to be speaking today on the sociology of genocide. But before that, just one very quick announcement for you, and that is to remind you that all of you will have received an email about the first meeting of the Human Rights Club, which is tomorrow evening. So you have emails, if you haven't checked them, with the location, which I believe is in Charlie Brown's, and I know it's early evening. I hope many of you who signed up will be able to be there. We will be forwarding your email addresses, so from here on out, you should be hearing from them directly. And I hope that many of you will have the chance to work with them directly as they plan their Darfur Awareness Days, which is April 3 to 13. Quick question?
Are they going to regularly meet on Wednesdays?
I don't know. You'll have to check with them. I know they meet fairly regularly, but there may be opportunities to have more informal meetings as people work on specific projects. I think that's mainly how they've been operating. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Myrna Goodman. Dr. Goodman's training is in sociology. She holds a doctorate from the University of California, Davis. Her area of specialization was the resistance movement in Denmark. I hope you would join me in welcoming her and in giving her your full attention this afternoon. Thank you.
I am a prisoner of technology. Am I blocking anybody's view? No? Okay, good. Bless you. Ta-da. Okay. Just a quick informal kind of statement about how I got myself to the place where I studied genocide. I had actually studied about the Holocaust from the time I was a small child. And my own interests are not only in resistance, but in rescuers. And I think you will see, as the lecture comes to its conclusion, that that has influenced me to this day. My topic for today is the sociology of genocide. Up until this point, we have been talking about the historical factors that contributed to the Holocaust. We're going to use the Holocaust once again, but now we're going to start broadening out our perspective about genocide. And the reason I have said in my classes, and I will reiterate to you, the reason that we study the Holocaust, among other things, is because it is what we call the prototypical genocide. If it happened in the Holocaust, it usually has happened in another genocide. But one of the things that you're going to find out today, as we go through this, is that there's a lot of disagreement over what exactly constitutes a genocide, and that several sociologists have taken it upon themselves to try and define when something is genocidal. And of course, one of the reasons for that is so that we can hopefully prevent a genocide, and that we're watching, when we look, we see the signs of a genocide. And so those are some of the elements that we have to look at. But one of the other things that we notice is that we don't know about genocides until they're over. Oh, 1 million people were starved to death. That's a genocide. Not 1 million people are starving to death. And one of the things that we're trying to work towards is recognizing when genocide is, when when mass killing and mass brutalization are leading up to genocide. So let's start. Hopefully the technology will behave. The technology will behave. Oh, the lights are, who turned the lights off?
You want to keep them off?
Let's see if people can see with the lights on. Okay? What's better? How many people vote on? Off? Okay, just a few people want to sleep, so we'll do this for the people who want to stay here. If you're not used to me, you know that I always do that kind of thing. Okay, let's see if I can... So the outline today is, I first want to talk about some historical examples of genocide. We know from some of the videos that we've seen that genocide has happened in both the ancient and the more current past. And unfortunately, it's happening in the present. And I want to talk about some of the precursors to the definitions, the modern definitions of genocide. Obviously, people have been killing others in large numbers, not just in the recent past, but also look at some of the historical instances, not all, but some. Then I want to talk about the origins of the definition of genocide, which you may have been exposed to, if you remember, in one of the videos we saw. But it's always nice to know, because some of my students say to me, well, I read about that before. Why did Professor Bittner repeat it? Well, things repeated often stick. I want to talk about the importance of Raphael Lemkin, who was a jurist, a lawyer, and then touch on the sociological contributions to our understanding of genocide. We understand the steps, the historical steps that led to the Holocaust, but let's look a little closer at the social processes that took place. And then we'll look at very specifically at the social processes that took place during the Holocaust. Did you do that, or did I do that? You did it, okay. All right, so here's a partial list of historical genocides. We saw this in the movie, the film, The Genocide Factor, the island state of Milos. The Christians of Japan, Native Americans in California. These are just some to give you an idea of the range that these things fall into. The Herreros in the colony in German Southwest Africa. The Armenians, we'll be studying more about that. The Ukrainians, the Soviets starved millions of Ukrainians, took the wheat that they were growing away and never returned any of it to them, so they starved in the 30s. Obviously the Holocaust, which is also known as the Shoah. And there have also been genocides in East Pakistan, in Cambodia, East Timor, Burundi. Of course, we all know about Rwanda, or hopefully we will learn about it, in Bosnia. Thank you. The first one I'll talk about is this is known as the Albigensian Crusades. And we should figure out how to do that. It was an early crusade against a Catholic sect that had split off from the major Catholic Church. They had their own beliefs, and they were called heretics, and there was an actual crusade against them, which took place in the early 13th century. Another genocide was when approximately 285,000 Catholics were murdered between 1587 and 1610 in Japan. These were people who were Catholic missionaries, Jesuits, and also Japanese who had converted to Catholicism. And this is one of our first examples of an entirely ideological genocide. The interesting thing that happened with this genocide was it ended around 1610. And for those of you who are either history majors or who have heard of this, once that genocide was over, Japan closed its doors to the West, and no one from the West could come to Japan until about the 18th century, I believe. The next is Native Americans. Over 150,000 Native Americans lived in California prior to the gold rush. This is just one example of a Native American genocide. By 1879, there were the population was only 31,000. Now, many died of diseases, but they were also chased off their land, marched to the missions. There's a mission not too far from here, the mission at Sonoma, where the Native Americans were marched and enslaved. And they were brutally murdered. Before there was some awareness about what had happened, the mission in Sonoma. Has anybody been there? Mission in Sonoma? They talked about how happy the natives were living with their with the settlers. Okay, so let's talk about some precursors to the modern definitions of genocide. Early on, when large numbers of people died, the definitions included barbarism and mass death. But in the 19th and the early 20th centuries, attempts included international treaties aimed at preventing war crimes and what they called crimes against humanity. Examples of these attempts at what we call making laws or codifying these crimes were called war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the Geneva Convention, which you've probably heard about, which defines how prisoners are to be treated and who is a combatant and who isn't a combatant, as well as the various treaties that were created in The Hague. And that forbid the murder of POWs, non-combatants, or acts such as sinking passenger ships. We hear these, the Geneva Convention referred to today, don't we? That there has been some question as to whether the United States is violating the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of combatants or civilians. Up, too far. Back one. Can you go back? Do you know how to go back? Okay. Let's see. All right, next one, please. Okay, so what is the origin of the term genocide? Well, the term did not exist or did not come into usage until after the World War II. It's a legal definition, and it was created directly to describe what had happened to the Jews in Europe or the systematic destruction of the European Jews. there was no way to describe that crime. Nothing had happened like that before. And the legal definition for those crimes was created so that the perpetrators could be brought to justice. And the first person to define the term was the jurist Raphael Lemkin. Well, who was Lemkin? Well, he was a Polish-Jewish scholar and a scholar of international law. His own background included some very personal experiences when he was growing up in an area that is in between what's now the Ukraine and Poland, where he personally witnessed pogroms. And you remember pogroms were those militia-based attacks against Jews in Russia. So he was born in 1901 in eastern Poland, the son of a Jewish farmer. He had a very well-educated mother, and she made sure that he received a very, very good education, even though he had been born in a rural area. And he was broadly educated in Poland, in Germany, and France, and was quite a renowned scholar. When the Germans occupied Poland in 1939, he fled for fear of his life because he was very aware of the possibility that being a Jew was not good for his health. And he framed the concept of genocide in 1943. Okay. You wait for me to do this, okay? All right. So what are the origins of the term genocide? The stem word is geno, which comes from the Greek word genos, which means race or tribe. We saw that in the film Master Race. I'm going to try and do this. Did you do that? It happened by itself. Okay. The suffix side is Latin for killer or act of killing. So you can see how the two terms go together to create the word genocide. I got it. Okay. As you can understand, or maybe you can't, there was a lot of wrangling to get at some sort of definition, a legal definition of the term genocide. And the United Nations legal definition is: genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And it includes the following factors: killing members of this group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, a kind of purposeful sterilization, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So the United Nations has this definition. Did you notice that there was a word missing in the description? Possibly you didn't. The word was political. And this would never have passed if there were political causes for genocide. Does anybody want to guess why? War? Actually, this is meant not, very specifically not to include acts of war between armies. This is about civilians. Yes? Could you speak up, Kathy? It would do what to the sovereign rights of states? Impose what upon them? Well, that's very close to what it was, but I mentioned 2 genocides in here, just before, that would have made this very difficult if we had put in political. The first one is, if we had put in political, the United States would be held responsible for the genocide of the Native Americans. In their expansion, their political expansion, Native Americans were murdered. The United States was a member of the Security Council at the time this was drafted. There was a second one that I mentioned. The Soviets denied the Ukrainians food. They took the wheat that they had grown, that is known as the breadbasket was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. After the harvest, they took all of the wheat back to the central part of the Soviet Union and sent none back, largely because, if you remember from our readings in Bergen about the Holocaust, the people in the Ukraine were enemies of the Soviet system. They did not want to be collectivized. That was a political genocide. The Soviets were members of the Security Council when this convention was drafted, and that's why politics is not in there, or political isn't. Okay, so we have some background about definitions of genocide, why it is a legal term that's important to define, and would anybody like to spit that back to me? Why is it important that we have a legal term to define genocide?
That way we can try people who commit genocide. We
Right.
have a legal standing against it that we can try murder and crime.
Right. If we have a law that is violated, we can bring people to trial for violating the law. Okay, so what are sociologists' research interests in genocide? Another way of saying that is, what do sociologists contribute to our understanding of genocide? Well, obviously, as students of society, we focus our research to broaden our understanding of the specific details of genocidal acts and events. What are the details that come together to create genocidal conditions? And what are the things that actually produce a genocide? We also ask the question, what are the dynamics of a genocide? What are the stages of a genocide? Because we know now from our study that genocide doesn't just happen. If we think back to what we've read about Nazi Germany, the genocide didn't just happen. There were various stages that led up to the extermination of the Jews in Europe, as well as the Roma and Sinti, as well as Slavs and other people that the Nazis had categorized as enemies of the Aryan state. Sociology also seeks to investigate, analyze, and generalize about the social phenomena connected to genocide. What things are there about how we interact in groups that contribute to genocide? So I'm going to throw another definition at you. If you have your reader, you'll know that there are several definitions in there, some of which I'm going to use today. And this one is the research definition from two sociologists from Canada, who were the first to try and put facts together so that we have some way of understanding things in a more unified way. And they say this is the very first sociological definition of genocide. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrator. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrators. So we have some elements here that as sociologists we look at, and that is that people are being separated out. They're being defined a certain way. In the Holocaust, we had great, elaborate efforts to define who was a Jew. The Germans went at it with all of their resources. Some of you have seen the chart that says who's a Jew and who's a half-Jew and who's a half-Jew 3 times removed, and you saw the SS man who said that his family history had been inspected back to the 1700s to make absolutely certain that he had no Jewish ancestors. The Nazis put a lot of effort into that. When we come to encounter Rwanda, we will see that there were very clear ways in which one group was set out for murder by another group. And who was in that group and who was in the other group were important factors. But those of you who are sociology majors probably know that we didn't want to let that rest, did we? So we have let me try something, Steph. No? No? Please. Okay. You got ready for it, right? There's another social scientist by the name of Israel Charney who says, and this is in your reader, so put your hand to rest maybe. Genocide in the generic sense is the mass killing of substantial numbers of human beings when not in the course of military forces of an avowed enemy under conditions of the essential defenselessness and helplessness of the victims. Someone mentioned war. He recognized that you needed to get the definition without that. Well, not to be left alone, Helen Fine, who is probably one of the most erudite scholars about genocide, she says, genocide is the sustained, purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity directly or indirectly through interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members, sustained regardless of the surrender or the lack of threat offered by the victim. To me, this doesn't help, because there are at least 4 or 5 more that I could have found to dazzle you with, and I can see you're all dazzled. But the reason they're trying to be so exact is because genocide keeps morphing. No sooner do you have one definition than someone takes into genocide using another definition. And it satisfies part of one definition and part of another definition. I am much more interested in trying to understand the processes attendant to this mass murder. I'm not a lawyer. Those are things that lawyers do, you know? They have to have all of the I's dotted and all the T's crossed. And I am, as a sociologist, interested in something else. Let me try. Okay. Now, I've got here 4 motives for genocide from ancient times to the present. And I would suggest to you that these are important. They're also created in something that sociologists call a typology. And that is where we give some typifications. What is typical of the reasons or the motives for genocide? And the first one is to eliminate a real or potential threat. That's a motive for committing genocide. To spread terror among real or potential enemies. To acquire economic wealth. And to implement a belief, a theory, or an ideology. Now, if we apply Porter's typology, and we see the Holocaust as what we call an ideal type. Is there any sociologist out there who would like to define what an ideal type is? Anybody want to guess what an ideal type is? Okay, an ideal type is a perfect example of something. An ideal type. First, the whole concept was coined by Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R. If we're going to recognize something, we need to know what it looks like. And before we know what something looks like, we have to typify it. So, using the Holocaust as this ideal type of a genocide, According to the scholar Jack Newson Porter, who is a sociologist who is also a survivor of the Holocaust, the major components of genocide are technology, Can you go back one? Okay. Well, let's go through this. I'm out of order here. Let's see, where did I leave off? Okay, let's go through this one. And I'll follow it along with you. My notes don't show it. Okay. All right. To eliminate a real or potential threat, to terrorize real or potential enemies, to acquire economic wealth, and to implement a belief, a theory, or an ideology. That is a typology of genocide. Okay. So, a genocide, to eliminate a real or potential threat. This is perhaps the oldest form of genocide, a real or imagined threat. Examples include the terror of Genghis Khan, Athens' murder of the men of Milosh, Shaka Zulu Empire, which took place in South Africa, and the Soviet-manufactured famine in the Ukraine, which I've mentioned to you. Genocide, to acquire economic wealth. This is also a very old one, and it's been associated with the colonization of the New World. And examples include the Pequots of New England and the Hereros of Southwest Africa. New World, Africa. The Hereros were in a colony that was of Germany, in what is now South Africa. Genocide, to implement a belief, theory, or ideology. Well, this is more recent in origin, and it differs from the first three in that the primary victims are members of the perpetrator state. Well, what's meant by that? Well, they actually live amongst the perpetrators. This is often carried out at great cost to the perpetrators. And examples include the Armenian Holocaust, genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide under the regime of Pol Pot, which took place just 30 years ago or so. Steph? Okay. Was just a little bit out of sync there in my notes. Okay, so Jack Newson Porter talks about 4 processes that are directly tied to genocide, and they're very important. The first one is technology. That is one of the very distinctive things that we know about the Holocaust. The second is ideology, which I've mentioned already. He says that technology, ideology, bureaucracy, and organization. Very, very typical of modern genocides. And the last is social disintegration of the victims. Now, you've been studying the Holocaust enough to look at that and go, right, I knew that. Right? Technology, ideology, bureaucracy, and social disintegration of the victims. Okay, let's talk about ideology first. Ideology is a belief system. Something that you believe, and because it's a system, everything kind of fits into it. It's not just one idea. It's a system, ideology. Anybody identify an ideology that we might subscribe to? Capitalism. The free market ideology. Yes? Pax Americana. Would you elaborate for our... Excuse me.
The idea that the United States is preordained to peace in the world.
Peace in the world. Thank you. Now, ideology is used to justify and legitimize discriminatory acts against victims. One ideology is anti-Semitism. Hitler laid that out in his Mein Kampf. So anti-Semitism is an ideology, and it's the example we use to talk about the Holocaust. That's not supposed to be there? Okay. Oop. The perpetrators use ideology to render their victims, use ideology to render their victims isolated, powerless, vulnerable, and outside the universe of moral obligation. Now, this doesn't show up all that well. But what is the universe of moral obligation? This is a very, very important concept. And one that you probably should think of. And the slide doesn't show up all that well. But
It's in the reader.
It's in the reader, on one page, all by itself. Well, this one's a little different, but it's still the same thing. Universe of obligation. At this point in what we're talking about, it's important to think about just who are we obliged to? Universe of moral obligation is that circle of persons towards whom obligations are owed, to whom the rules apply, and whose injuries call for attention and healing. Do you think that the Jews were inside that universe of moral obligation during the Holocaust? No. What I ask students to do at this point is to kind of go off on another mental place and think without having to volunteer it. Who do we put in our universe of moral obligation? To whom do we owe support? Is it just our family and friends? Does it go out wider than that? To other groups? To just the citizens of the United States? Okay. I want to go on to the third. We're talking about ideology. This is an ideology. Okay, let's talk about bureaucracy. For those of you who have never seen a picture of him, this is Adolf Eichmann. And I consider him the premier bureaucrat. An ideal type. But bureaucracy is usually composed of politicians and political leaders, top-level decision makers, military leaders, clerks, military personnel, guards, and ordinary people. And the people at the top set the policy, and everybody under them in the bureaucracy jumps on board. You know, if you go into financial aid and you say, I didn't get my check yet. Somebody up above, well, you can't have your check. Why not? Well, my boss told me I'm not supposed to hand out the checks until 3:30. I got that one once. It was 2:45. Okay, so when we have genocide, we usually have some sort of bureaucratic organization that is at work. If not a bureaucracy, then there's an organization. Technology. This is an example, the Holocaust is an example of modern technology. When we uncover the technology of building the crematoria and the gas chambers, and they went through several steps in refining the technology that they used. But you should know that 800,000 people were murdered in Rwanda in the short space of a month with machetes. Does everybody know what a machete is? It's kind of a long knife. It just goes to show that technology can take all kinds of, be displayed in all kinds of guises. So, technology, ideology, bureaucracy, and the one that is so important to sociologists, and that is social disintegration. The social disintegration of victims of the Holocaust went through 5 stages. The first one was definition of who was a Jew. The setting apart of Jews just simply by definition. Who knows when that was done? Who can tell me?
Was that the Nuremberg laws?
The Nuremberg laws. You remember the date? Not the exact date.
39-ish?
Anybody else? Yes? No? Going once? Going twice? Who's got it? Somewhere in between. 35. 1935. Write it down. 1935, the Nuremberg Laws. The most important thing about that is what they did, though, not necessarily the date. The next step was to strip Jews of their livelihoods and possessions. Jews weren't allowed to be in the civil service. Jewish doctors could no longer practice. Jewish lawyers could not practice. Jewish businesses were appropriated, forced sale. People could no longer make a living because their avenues for doing that were restricted legally. Jews were segregated from the larger population. There were Jewish houses in Germany, places where Jews had to live, and the only people who could live there were Jews. In Germany, but not everywhere, Jews were required to what? Wear a yellow star. In some places, they had to wear one on the front and the back, so you could see if someone was a Jew coming and going. This was not universally done, by the way. There are some people who think that the Jews made everybody wear, the Germans made every Jew wear a yellow star, but that did not happen. Jews were isolated from the rest of society. I need to say no more than ghetto. Jews were concentrated in ghettos, concentration camps, taken out of the larger society, and eventually murdered. These are the 5 stages of social disintegration, taking people out of society. I would suggest to you that this is something we would look at if we saw something happening and we thought, is this a precursor to a genocide?
Would another form of that not just being stripped of their livelihoods and possessions, but stripped of their rights as citizens?
Right. That's what the Nuremberg laws did. Stripped them of their rights as citizens. A very important point. But this was also separating and isolating Jews. Okay, so the other thing that sociologists think about is who were the social actors during the Holocaust? What roles did people play? What was the way that we might define their participation? It freezes up when I... Okay, so the social actors during the Holocaust were categorized as perpetrators, victims, rescuers, and bystanders. Some of the categories of perpetrators are top-level decision makers were perpetrators. There were desk murderers. Eichmann was, to a large extent, not a decision maker. He was a desk murderer, someone who sat at a desk and facilitated the deaths of people. I mentioned to one of my sections that there was a documentary that was made called Shoah, which is the word for Holocaust. And one of the people that was interviewed worked for the German railway. And he was a desk murderer. His task was to send trains to Poland, full. Many people don't know that Jews from Germany especially bought their own tickets. Lucille Eichengreen's family had to buy tickets for their journey to the east on the German railway system. When asked, did you know what was happening? This fellow said, well, no, my job was just to send the trains east, full. And when he was asked about, well, did you know they were coming back empty? He said, I didn't pay any attention to that. My job was to send the trains full. So it gives you some sense. People had to be moved from Western Europe to Poland. How many people might have been involved with this? Not only were they bureaucrats, but they were perpetrators. Willing executioners, perpetrators. We've read about them. People who actually did the killing face to face. Nothing would have taken place if it wasn't for them. But everybody had their part. Compliant killers, the ordinary men. And it was mostly men who were conscripted and sent to Poland and sent out day after day to round up 100 Jews in a small town, have them go outside the town, dig a pit, and then they shot them face to face. Then there were, yes?
I read the book.
Which book? Christopher Browning's book?
And it just struck the strenuous effort, that the Army made to the Cathars soldiers. They labeled it courageous to overcome their personal
Inhibitions?
ethics of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
So if they overcame that, the Army called that courage.
Right. Heroic.
I mean, upside down.
Flipped everything upside down. One of the most important things about these compliant killers is the social pressure that was put on them. And I always ask people to say, well, just think of junior high. You all stepped in when someone was being treated badly and said, don't do that. This is a nice person. You're acting like animals. And the reason that you didn't do it was because you were afraid yourself at not so much punishment, but being seen as someone who doesn't play the game. And I would suggest to you that, even though we haven't read it this semester, that is largely what happened, and that was social pressure. Then there were the rescuers. We have had the privilege of having Knut Dybe, who is a Danish rescuer, come and speak to us. 2 years ago, he said that was the last time he felt he had the energy. He's quite old. He was named a righteous person by Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is the authority in Israel that is responsible for, it's a museum that's responsible for remembering the Holocaust. And one of the things that they do is they take testimony from people who were rescued by people. And they name them righteous people, and they plant trees, and they honor them. My own work is in studying Denmark and what happened there. Denmark happens to be the only country that was named as a righteous person. It was named as a righteous country because of how widespread the actions in defense of the Jews were. There were righteous people in every country, including a group of diplomats, one of whom was from Japan, who handed out visas and passports for Jews who were trapped in Lithuania and enabled them to escape via the Soviet Union. We learn more and more. There were Portuguese diplomats in Poland who gave visas to people who were able to get to Portugal, which was a neutral country. But the country with the most rescuers was also the country that had the most Jews. And which one was that? Poland, right. I read in the paper today that someone died who was a righteous person in what was now Russia, who at the age of 13 saved a 10-year-old Jewish, or he was 10, he saved a 13-year-old Jewish boy, took him home, who he had found starving, and his family sheltered him. He eventually emigrated to Israel with his Jewish wife. He married a Jewish woman after the war, and he passed away today. But the largest group of people, Steph? Well, not the largest group, but it never fails to bother me to no end to note that 1 million victims of the Nazis were children. But we also need to remember, and we all know this because we've been studying the Holocaust, that the Nazis' victims also included Jehovah's Witnesses, Poles, Russians, POWs, homosexuals, the Roma and the Sinti, communists, political opponents, and countless others. We also know that the first victims, organized group of victims of the Nazis, were who? Who? Communists. Organized. Paul? Political opponents. The mentally ill and disabled. Right. But most of them, most of the people, were bystanders. What was a bystander? It was someone who said, I cannot be bothered with that. I don't want to put myself or my family in jeopardy. I'm just going to go along and live my daily life. And one can imagine that that was a responsible choice at some point, and that maybe most people didn't have an opportunity to do something else. Yes?
On the collective world response, is that due to misinformation and lies from the Nazis?
was the world's lack of response due to collective lies? That's really a very complicated question, but I would say that it would, in addition to there being political influence, that it was also largely due to a kind of ideology that turned people from thinking that it was something important to do.
I think the story was St. Louis in 1959.
Would you like to? Let me do it. Let me do it for you. A ship of Jews got visas to go to Cuba. Is that correct? There were visas to go to Cuba, and
I didn't know, but they were most of them were fake.
they were what?
Most of them were fake. They didn't know.
They were fake. They didn't know that they were fake, and the ship was turned back at. They got to go to the United States, and the ship was turned back because the visas were fake or not real. Men, women, children, families. They tried to get into Cuban ports, and they were turned away there, and they eventually had to go back to Germany. So there was the Wagner Act also, which limited immigration to the United States. There were several people who tried to increase the number of Jews who came to the United States. We had immigration quotas. The prospect was set forward that just children would be allowed to come into the United States, and that was turned away because they might take jobs from Americans. To say that anti-Semitism was involved, there were very large anti-Semitic movements in the United States. President Roosevelt was very cautious on what he did because they were accusing him of being a Jew lover. So the world's response is very, very complicated. One of the things that might tip us off to it being anti-Semitic was the New York Times has done a study of what was printed in the New York Times during this whole period and where did it appear in the paper. And it is almost ridiculously absent from the front pages and shoved back in Section 2 and Section 3 that these great catastrophes were befalling the Jews in Europe. So, like anything, it's very complicated. You can't ascribe it to one thing or another. Okay, for your reading for this week, you had a reading from Samantha Powers, who wrote the book A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. And it's an analysis not only of, and gives you some good information about Lemkin, but it also points out that we have been far from an ideal world citizen in using our power to prevent these kinds of things. And one of the quotes from her is, that intolerance and indifference are our most lethal pair of foes. That on the one hand, we are somewhat intolerant of other people's situation, and on the other hand, we're largely indifferent. And she says that we should attend to the current situation in Darfur, that is the genocide that is happening as we sit leisurely today and talk about genocide. She talks about how the United States has failed to use its power in the service of preventing genocide. I would recommend the book to you if you haven't read it. Won a Pulitzer Prize. There are things that speak well of it, and that is that students seem to really enjoy it. So that means it's accessible, and the language is not difficult. Her point is that if we remain silent and don't push our government to take action, that our government doesn't take action. And that when we take action, the government has to sit up and listen. And as cynical as it is to say, oh, that's really a bunch of BS, it is happening. We're going to have Jerry Fowler, who is the director of the Committee on Conscience, come and talk with us later in the series. And he will talk about the efforts at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to get the government to act, to get the government to intercede. And that is what the Human Rights Club has been doing for 2 years. Not only raising their voices, but also raising money and doing some important work in Sudan, or important work that goes towards Sudan. That is a picture of some of what's going on. Steph? Armed militias are forcing people across the border from Sudan, from the Darfur region, into Chad, largely based on different characteristics of groups, farmers and grazers and military people, Muslims against believers in the native spiritual tradition. Children are being orphaned. The Janjaweed, or militia groups, are attacking with helicopters on small villages, burning their houses to the ground, raping and maiming women and children. It's happening right now. It's not genocide that happened in the 18th century or in Japan or in the 17th century. It's happening right now. And if nothing happens in this class, the thing that usually happens is that our awareness of the world around us is raised, and we get a small opportunity to stand outside of ourselves for a while. These are places where potential genocides are happening. Chechnya, Pakistan, India, the Sudan, and the Congo. 10,000 people a day are dying in the Congo. Uganda, Zimbabwe. There have been genocides in Central America among indigenous people. Right now, how many of you have heard the term pygmy? Okay. They're the Bantus, the little people who live in, let's see if I can, this part of Africa, in the forests. Isolated, don't have much contact with the outside world, but guess what they're sitting on in their native homelands?
Oil.
No? Diamonds. Diamonds. Their way of life is tremendously threatened. Groups, Survival International, Genocide Watch are all calling alerts. They're asking people not to buy diamonds because not only does that market fuel what's going on there, but it also is the cause for lots of mistreatment in other parts of Africa. Okay, so let's go over this real quickly. What are sociologists' research interests in genocide? Well, basically it's the third one, that we want to investigate, analyze, and generalize about the social phenomena that are associated and connected with genocide. What are the four motives for people who commit genocide? They see people as a real or imagined threat, or a potential threat. Think about the best example that we have right now that we've studied in the Holocaust. To spread terror among real or imagined enemies. To acquire economic wealth. There is a Holocaust survivor, one of the only people to have escaped from Auschwitz. Yes, Auschwitz. Who says that the Holocaust was the biggest robbery in history. Everybody else is talking about mass death and everything, and he said, think about what was taken. What was stolen, the real estate, the cash, the diamonds, the businesses, the wealth. Did any of you happen to see the PBS series Auschwitz that was on? Did you get to watch the whole thing? 2 or 3. Did you see the first one? Lucille is in the first one. If you remember. Yeah. They showed what was at stake at Auschwitz if you were a guard. There were these cabinets. They did a recreation of someone's testimony. They showed a cabinet filled with money. And one guy who that was his job, was just to take the money and transport it to Germany once a month. And he'd count it out. And he'd put enough for himself in his pocket. Okay, and to implement a belief, a theory, or an ideology. If we look at what happened in the Holocaust, we realize that that was really the most important thing to the Nazis, because they did things in the name of ideology that went directly against their economic interests. Trains going places full and coming back empty. Soldiers being used to work in death factories instead of being involved in the military operations. the resources that they could have taken from people who had skills. How many again saw Schindler? Do you remember the factory? Now Schindler was making, he had to think up things to make that would keep him in business. Remember, he was trying to figure out what to make, and he was making the mess kits for the German soldiers. And we've had Bernard Offen, who was here. He didn't speak, but he's been here, working in a factory making shoes. Of course, they didn't make perfect shoes. They put stitches in them that came out the minute a soldier tried to tromp through the mud. So I would say, the Nazis worked mostly fueled by this motive of ideology. Okay, let's remember the four processes that are involved in genocide. Technology, ideology, bureaucracy and organization, and the social disintegration of the victims. And the definition of an ideology is that it is a belief system. It isn't necessarily a positive belief system or a logical belief system, but it is a system that people associate lots of ideas with. Sticky key. Bureaucracy. Our infamous Adolf Eichmann. Technology. I have to figure out how to create these factories of death. I don't know how that one got in there. But I do want to close then with Dybye. He was an extremely heroic person. He was a Danish policeman and was responsible for ferrying lots of people to the boats that took Jews to Sweden. But the thing about Denmark that makes it unique also is a lesson to us, and that is Denmark as a country has been named as a righteous nation because everybody did something, even if they didn't do anything. They turned their heads away, not because people were being hurt, but because people were being saved. Yes?
In regards to the social phenomenon of genocide, you as a sociologist, and the years that you've been at it now, do you see a trend moving toward more awareness of human beings now? Are we changing?
One of the things we're eventually going to discuss in this class, and we are going to have someone by the name of Jim Waller talk about becoming evil, is we're going to talk about obedience and how we are not particularly taught to be disobedient, or we're not encouraged to be disobedient. You know that phrase, the question authority. Our whole society works to make us very compliant. And that's where rescuers don't particularly believe in being compliant with the ideology. But that's a whole another lecture. One last one. Leave you with this notion of a universe of moral obligation, and for us to perhaps think about just who are we obliged to? How far out does our circle of obligation go? And what is the characteristic of what we consider our definition of what our obligation is. I did leave a part out of this lecture, and that is this whole notion of obedience, because Jim Waller is going to present a very cogent description of the processes attendant to what he calls in his book Becoming Evil. Any questions? I know I've been extremely thorough. Yes?
Well, I guess maybe it's more of a comment, but I just find it incredible that after a century of so much genocide, the world still does not have some kind of rapid response plan for genocide. Lately, there's been all this talk about devoting thousands of more UN troops to Darfur, but it's going to take a year for them to get there. And I guess it just kind of speaks to how little we're willing to do when we don't have this capability of quick action, where we're saying, okay, we're going to allow thousands more people to die before we do it.
As Americans, we are very much interested in solutions and quick ones. Want to get it done. And it's very hard for us to not get cynical when things don't happen really quickly. We don't particularly have enough of a history to take a long view. And I would suggest to you that I'm an optimist. I think that things are changing. We don't have the rapid response that we need. But we are beginning to understand that we need to push harder on our politicians. And that's what Samantha Power says. And that is, before, nobody would say the word genocide. Because if you said it, you had to acknowledge that it was happening. Now, with the Bush administration, they say genocide, but they still don't do anything. So I consider it a very positive step that over 30 of you signed up for information about the Human Rights Club. And even if you do a small thing like throwing a dollar bill into a collection plate that we're going to send around, or if you send a postcard to the powers that be, all in the Senate and in the House, our representatives, it starts with you. And a couple of years ago, there was not that kind of interest. So we have to take a longer view and still act. It's important that we act. Anybody else? I mean, you're doing an incredible thing just by saying, okay, I'm going to take this series. I've heard good things about it. Okay. See you all in section. Thank you. I don't know what's wrong with this.